years. Right? Some states do that. Ban only for crimes involving dishonesty or that are malum in se, as Professor Berman suggested. Ban them only from criminal juries and not civil. Ban them only for crimes that aren't victimless. Ban them only for a period of time. You know, you might say, well, felons are bad people because most of them commit crimes again. And that's true. Recidivism rate's over 50%. But generally speaking, if they're going to do it again, they do it within that first 5 years. So, after 5 years, they're okay. Or at least as okay as the rest of us. Most of all, again, think about it. Think about it. In a system of otherwise inclusive jury pools and carefully selected jury panels, it's excessive to cast out every felon from every case forever. This is evident not just from the fact that the other 20 states are still standing, despite allowing felons on their juries, but that in the majority that do ban felons, again, they don't even bother to overturn the verdicts that emerge from that system. I hope that I have demonstrated here something that might have seemed obvious, that once you probe it a little bit, it gives up some of its weaknesses. Law school is filled with tons of such opportunities. I'm drawn to this particular one for the same reason that I've spoken out, somewhat mildly, but still, against affirmative action. That is, I don't like it when the government makes sweeping generalizations about people. Right? I think that's the exact wrong thing for government to do. That's where I come to this from. But if you don't agree with me, I'm sure there are some assumptions out there you will enjoy questioning. And even if you end up believing the same thing you came in with, the process is always good too. And with that, I hope I have time to answer some questions that you might have about all of this, or if you'd like to debate a little bit. If I haven't convinced you, yes.
As a practical matter, why would a prosecutor not use every tool in his arsenal to get a felon off the jury?
Same reason he wouldn't try and get a law professor off the jury, right? Well, look at it from the inherent bias standpoint. Okay, one reason might be that he thinks the guy's biased in his favor, right? The guy might still be on probation. He might be eager to please. Two, he might have the sort of understanding of the reality of what's going on. He knows a guilty person when he sees one, right? Second, even if you believe that the prosecutor would, in every case, challenge every felon, which I doubt, you would still not want to necessarily not even let that person in the door. First of all, there are civil cases. Second of all, there are cases where the prosecutor might say, okay, this is the one exception. But third, make it challengeable for cause. Some states do that. Bring them in, let the parties challenge for cause. If they challenge them, they're gone. But if they don't, let them stay. Now, as to why they wouldn't, because the same reason they let a law professor on, because again, some person who committed a felony, certain communities, that's a rite of passage to get prosecuted. Right? And so you're not going to be able to distinguish, that person is that different from someone else. There might be other people who, for whatever reason, are not convicted felons, but have all sorts of other things about them that make them undesirable jurors. Someone might have been a felon, but turned his life around. Someone else might not be a felon, have 30 relatives who are in prison and has a grudge against the government, an inherent bias against the government, and the prosecutor would rather get that person off the jury. So again, give the prosecutor a chance to decide for himself. And if he wants to exclude every felon, well, okay, but you still got civil cases.
Could you say a little more about that area in Idaho that you mentioned?
Yeah, it's well, I wrote an article in the Georgetown Law Journal called "The Perfect Crime," and you can check it out there. There's also an article in the National Enquirer about it in 2005, and I was on National Public Radio's All Things Considered. It sort of ran the gamut, and it's a Sixth Amendment argument. I'll just leave it at that. I wrote a follow-up article called "Tabloid Constitutionalism," based on the Enquirer thing. The idea was, the article came out, I wanted to get it changed, the law, and Congress didn't respond to my letters. It's not that they didn't change the law, it's they didn't acknowledge, like you write to McDonald's, and they will say, oh, thank you for writing to us about the 6th Amendment, here's some coupons. They didn't even acknowledge that I'd written to them. But then someone wrote a New York Times best-selling novel with my argument as a plot device. Then they started talking to me, and then I found out why they weren't going to do anything about it. But not why they ignored me in the first place. But the short answer to why is juries. Juries. And the 6th Amendment.
So, I mean, if I'm following your argument, you would be okay with voir dire, peremptory, or for cause challenges if somebody just said, if the prosecutor or defense said, I don't want felons, that would be okay with you. And I guess my question is, you also mentioned, my criminal procedure is rusty, but we talked about how, you know, those challenges aren't unlimited. You can't just go.
Peremptories aren't unlimited.
Right. And like, I mean, you couldn't say I don't want white women for this particular case or black men for this particular case. And I guess I wondered, you know, when you talked about the racial makeup of felons, do you think that that would cause any problems as far as, you know, are you really dismissing somebody because they're a felon, or is it a backdoor way to dismiss them because they're black or Hispanic or whatever?
Yeah, well, the first thing is, if it's for cause, then you don't have a number problem. You don't have to worry about running out. If they're peremptories, if the prosecutor really has that much of a problem with felons, then yeah, you might have an issue there. They'd have to use up all of their peremptories that way, and you might have a Batson problem. That doesn't bother me. Here's the thing. When we have a system like this, you say, oh, felons are banned from juries forever, and it's based on some historic understanding. Well, Holmes said it's revolting to do something just because it was done that way at the time of Henry IV. This actually dates back to Henry IV, right? They said, no felons on the juries. Why? Well, first of all, usually they were dead, so that made them not such good jurors. Two, if they weren't, they were in Australia, right, or in the colonies somewhere. But then, when they started moving away from that, they said, well, who's on the jury? The better sort of people, right? 12 good men and true is the classic formulation. And it's only in our own modern, post-Jacksonian America that the idea of having everyone in the jury pool emerges. So felons used to not be on the jury because they were not the sort of people who would get picked. But then once it's everyone, then you have to start being specific. And here's the thing. When you have 1% of the population as felons, okay, not a big deal. But when it's 6.5%, then you start to get into some issues with, this doesn't mean what it meant when they started doing it. This worst 1% of society, okay, you can, it's like Berman was saying, it doesn't mean the same thing to be a felon as it did when we set this up. So if the assumptions have changed, if applying the same rule is giving a very different result, then you need to rethink that rule. Furthermore, on the racial disparity, the thing is, it's not like voting where the history is only in, well, after the Civil War, 14th and 15th Amendment pass, and it becomes clear that you can't exclude people from jury service or from voting because of their race. But the southern states still wanted to exclude people from voting and from jury service because of race. So they needed to find some other way to do it. So they started banning people for being felons. Now, again, you couldn't be on a jury if you were a felon before, but it was never stated in the statute. So what did they do? Here's how they did it. They wanted to ban, but there were white criminals and black criminals. So what did they do? Mississippi, in 1890, decided to exclude from voting and jury service those convicted of bribery, burglary, theft, arson, obtaining money or goods under false pretenses, perjury, forgery, embezzlement, or bigamy. Missing from that list, murder. And the Mississippi Supreme Court explained at the time, approvingly, in a voting case, someone was challenging the voting restriction, this lineup of offenses that were counted was designed to exclude black men who were seen as, quote, given rather to furtive offenses than to the robust crimes of the whites. Right? So if you define what's a felony a certain way, if you define who's excluded a certain way, and then give prosecutorial discretion, then you see how that can be used. Now, again, I'm not saying that that's why 30% of adult black men are excluded and a rather smaller number of white women would be. I'm not saying that's why they do it, but if you hear that history, you have to think, just saying, well, they didn't want to get this consequence, they shouldn't have committed a felony. It's not that simple. The decisions that the system makes at every stage to decide who's going to be cast out and who's not is always going to be both over and under inclusive. That was like a 10-minute non-answer to your question, so I apologize.
How do you resolve the apparent paradox between felons who are allowed to vote, electing officials who then deny them the right to serve on a jury, or not the right to serve on a jury, but preclude them from jury service? I mean, it seems like they're exercising free will, democratically electing people who then not necessarily take away a right, take away them from serving on a jury.
Yeah, if you look in the 60s, the overwhelming majority of states banned both voting and jury service, and they've stopped doing that with the voting. The jury service has sort of stayed put. A couple of states, every once in a while, one will change one way or the other. But it's ironic, but I don't think that there aren't a lot of examples of states, whatever the jury equivalent of disenfranchising people is. They just sort of leave it the way it is. And they did it at a time when there weren't that many, and those people weren't voting. So yeah, it's ironic. I think it's also hard to argue politically, to stand up in the state legislature and say, what we need to do is to be sure we have enough felons on our juries, and who's with me, right? Oh, it's an election year. Oh, it's not an election year, but still, you just can't do that. But if you look, some states do. Some states do. One just did a couple of years ago. They just moved it the other way. This is an area where people don't care much. And here's the thing, and Berman joked about this a little bit. If you really think that jury service, what is jury service, right? Is it a right that you have as a citizen, or is it a responsibility that you have as a citizen? If it's a responsibility, and we do call it jury duty after all, if it's a responsibility, then why should you get the break for being a felon, right? I mean, it's more like being drafted than it is like voting. We don't have to draft anymore, but if it's a responsibility, we should, as one of my colleagues suggested, make them the only ones who are on a jury. Make them do it. So all of that is sort of put together here, and yet the bottom line is people don't care. Whatever changes are made in states, it's not after a hard-fought statewide campaign with lots of funny TV commercials. It's just sort of slipped into a bill because someone says, hey, let's do this, and could be one way, could be the other. After I wrote this article, the ABA Committee for Standards on Juries changed its recommendation to agree with me. Purely coincidental, but, well, not purely coincidental. They read my article, they cited it. And that has had zero effect. Which is to say, one state has followed the recommendation and one has done the opposite.
Are there any similar characteristics between these 20 states that allow it? I just know there's certain, when it comes to like electing judges, typically, the early colonies, they don't elect judges. Is there any common characteristics?
I can't find any rhyme or reason to it. In this area, Indiana is the only one that doesn't ban for life. Michigan bans for life, Ohio bans for life, Kentucky bans for life. Indiana doesn't. West Virginia bans for life. I looked, I did some charts and said, do I see any patterns here? No. I don't think so.
Just touching on your point on, I think maybe like a broader policy point with people may just not care enough.